in search here of this American icon. Well, to formally begin, in terms of his early life, he's born in a log cabin in Kentucky, in the small town of Elizabethtown, on February 12, 1809. He's the second child of Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks. He has an older sister, Sarah, who was born almost 2 years to the day before him, on February 10th, 1807. And here, for the Lincoln family, they are indeed very, very poor. This was super common, especially here in the early 19th century when you got west of the Appalachians. So you have here the American colonies, going back to the 1700s, the original 13, trying to break free of British control. They succeed. And the expansion then would go from the eastern seaboard. It had already gone from the eastern seaboard to the Appalachians. Now it's going to go beyond that, and the next area that's going to be worked upon will be all the way to the Mississippi. The Mississippi. So if we're talking the West, here in the overview of the nation at this time, the western part would mean, quite frankly, where we're standing right here, this territory. A territory long before even Wisconsin becomes a state in the mid-19th century. Well, the Lincoln family is like countless other families living here in Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin territory, or what eventually is going to be known as all of that, in that they are engaged here in farming, and they are very, very poor, desperately poor. Well, Thomas Lincoln and Nancy Hanks would eventually have here, 4 years after Abraham was born, another son who would be Thomas Jr. So for these kids, it was difficult, very, very difficult. And you have to understand that life in the 19th century in the United States, it tended to be very brutal, very short. To give you an example, the life expectancy of an American born here in 1810 to 1820 was 39 years. 39 years. Now, in fairness, those numbers are skewed a bit. And they're skewed a bit due to the fact that you have this ungodly high infant mortality rate. If you lived to be 5, you probably were going to make it into your 50s. Okay? Late 50s, it'd be kind of iffy. But because here so many kids die of all sorts of things, and because fever and disease is widespread, you have here a very, very low life expectancy, which just added here, and added to the difficulties, to the challenges across the board for the Lincolns as well as countless other families. Well, Abraham Lincoln was very much aware of his humble origins. He never tried to hide it in any way, shape, or form. But he would oftentimes downplay them too by stressing that it is a great piece of folly to attempt to make anything out of my early life. There's an attempt here to make anything out of my early life. Well, his younger brother, who was born just a few years after, dies here at the age of just 10 months old. And there's really, in Kentucky, there's really not a great deal of agricultural promise or potential. So Thomas Lincoln decides here that he is going to pack up the family and move formally to Indiana territory. And in search here of a better life. They're out in this frontier life here in Kentucky, and it's time to look somewhere else. He's heard reports that there's a good deal of land that would be very inexpensive in this Indiana territory, and in that regard, potentially, the sky would be the limit, or at least it would be a significant improvement for this family, that is in fact here genuinely struggling. Well, as we look here up at our overhead, we can see a map of what the United States looked like around the time of the birth of Abraham Lincoln and in his early years. And you can see in the territory, Kentucky is technically a state at this time, but they're now going to be moving into Indiana territory. And what happens here is that they're in Pigeon Creek, Indiana, and it's a very, very small area, very small rural community. And it's not any easier. It is not here any easier, not by any stretch of the imagination. And Abraham Lincoln was close to his mother. His father, not so much so. His father, Thomas, was somebody who believed in the value of hard work, and certainly he had passed this on to his son Abraham, as well as to his daughter, the oldest of the family, Sarah. But by the same end, the two of them just really did not get along from very early on in Abraham's childhood. By comparison, he got on just fine with his mother. However, here in Indiana Territory, his mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, she fell ill. She fell ill with what was called milk sick, or milk sickness at the time. What this was is it was a poisonous root, the snake root plant, here in the western part of the United States, the midwestern part of the United States in the present day, that cows would eat, and it wouldn't impact cows. But what would happen here with this poisonous plant is it would be passed on then from the cows through their milk onto humans. And it was deadly. It was deadly here for humans. And in September of 1818, Abraham Lincoln's mother died. She was just 34 years of age. At this stage, he was only 9. He'd already lost his younger brother, Thomas, and now he's lost his mother. Well, from the standpoint of his father, Thomas Lincoln, and this is the situation here is going in essence, it's going from bad to worse. And Thomas Lincoln is in a scenario here that he needs somebody, because he's out farming fields, etc. He needs somebody to take care of his 2 children. And he has heard that back in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, back here in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, there was a woman that he actually knew her. He knew her husband too as well, Sarah Bush Johnston. And Sarah Bush Johnston was a widow. Her husband had died like 10 months before. And literally here within a few months here, within a year of the death of Thomas Lincoln's wife. So what he does is he heads back with his 2 younger children, Sarah and Abraham, back to Elizabethtown and talks here with this woman, and she is a widow with 3 kids. And basically, the 2 of them decide, I mean, she is desperate. She needs help here. Financially, she's completely and utterly strapped. He needs somebody to look after his 2 kids. She's got 3 of her own. They decide in terms of the step to make on to being married. So Thomas Lincoln here is going to remarry, and he is going to remarry here Sarah Bush Johnston. And so the blended family, there's now a total of 5 kids. Well, you'd hear, in essence, you'd hear these stories all the time as Thomas Lincoln, Abraham's father, is 41 years of age. Sarah, his new wife, is 31 years of age. You hear the stories all the time of the evil stepmother, etc. Or that, in this case here, Sarah Bush Johnston, or now Sarah Lincoln, that she would end up favoring her own, and that Abraham and Sarah would be kind of like swept off to the side. That did not happen. In fact, the greatest influence on Lincoln's entire life was his stepmother. Here, Sarah. And she was an individual who he would have with him his entire life. She actually even outlives him. And it's a case here that she becomes his total hero. First and foremost, Sarah Bush Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's stepmother, brought structure. She brought structure and order to the Lincoln household. Second of all, what young Abraham as well as his sister received here from their stepmother was unconditional love and concern for them both. Third, she encouraged, knowing full well that young Abe was not overly interested in farming. She discovered that what he really loved was reading. She could read as well. She would help him. She would help teach him how to read. He had a rudimentary knowledge. But she is going to encourage this. And even at the time, as they're moving back to Indiana, they're back in Pigeon Creek, what they're doing here is Lincoln is going to go to school for the first time at the age of 10. And he has just 1 year, literally, of formal school. That's it for his entire life. But what he became obsessed with, was reading. Reading. and learning, as it was referred to at that time. And he would read anything and everything. He would get a book, a couple of books. He would not just read the book once, he would read it twice, across the board. Well, his father saw very, very little use for this. Yes, he was out helping in the fields too as well, no doubt about that. But in terms of learning how to read and write, it really didn't matter, I mean, when all is said and done. But behind the scenes, his stepmother knew this is what her stepson loved, and she encouraged it. She encouraged it day after day. Well, because